Hi, everyone. Erich Prince here, Editor-in-Chief of Merion West, and I'm joined today by Yoram Hazony, who is the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation and president of the Herzl Institute, and Henry George, one of our writers and sort of longtime contributors since 2017, who has engaged pretty extensively with Yoram Hazony's work, initially in sort of back and forth with Matt McManus on his book, The Virtue of Nationalism, back in 2018, and on June 20th wrote a review of Yoram's latest book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, which I think was sort of the catalyst for the interview. And Henry, thank you for that. Visual aid is very good of the book. So thank you both for being here. And maybe I'll ask just one question to get things started. And Yoram, could you perhaps talk about sort of 4-year span or so between the release of The Virtue of Nationalism and Conservatism, a Rediscovery, and sort of how those two works flowed from one another, or the sort of thought process that you had about wanting to follow up The Virtue of Nationalism, which is a very widely covered and reviewed book, and I know you received a lot of commendations for it, and what made you kind of want to come back a few years later swinging with Conservatism, a Rediscovery?
Sure. Well, look, the main thing that happened between The Virtue of Nationalism and in 2018 and Conservatism, a Rediscovery in 2022 is that in 2020, the hegemony of liberal ideas in America and Britain and other countries collapsed. It ended. We've all grown up under whether we love liberalism or have criticisms for liberalism or detest liberalism, all of us have grown up in a world in which liberal assumptions dominated the public sphere and political life. And I include, most of the leading figures in both the Democratic and Republican Party, and most of the leading figures in Labour and the Conservative Party in the UK and across Europe. And the momentous shift that took place when the New York Times began expelling liberal writers for having liberal ideas, traditional, somewhere between classical liberal and progressive liberal, that when that became something you could be kicked out of your job, a senior position at the New York Times for that, or when being a crucial historic liberal figure like Woodrow Wilson became insufficient for your name to appear on a building at Princeton University. At that time, there was a major cultural change. I think all of us know that this change took place, and that creates a need to go much deeper than I was able to go in The Virtue of Nationalism. Now, the main question that young people have been asking since 2020, I mean, I've been hearing this for years, but I think since 2020, it's become kind of, just an overwhelming demand to hear the answer to one question. And that question is, why do you conservatives think that you're capable of conserving anything? It seems as though conservatism, regardless of how you define it and how you see it, doesn't conserve things. And so it's worthless, and we need something else. And the main impetus for writing this book, I mean, it's a complicated book. There's all sorts of things going on in the book. I'm answering all sorts of different questions, but the main question is, it looks like the liberal order is coming to an end. Certainly, liberalism has already shrunk down to one of many different views that are contending for control of the public space. And this woke neo-Marxism is making a bid to become the new hegemonic set of ideas. And in this context, the first question is, does conservatism actually have anything at all to say? And so I decided that I would write a book whose focus is trying to understand the life of conservation and transmission, both at the level of the private individual, families, congregations, and also at the national level. And those are things that maybe were touched on glancingly in the Virtue of Nationalism, but here I devoted really a very, very significant amount of space to answer all of those questions that people correctly ask about conservatives.
So Yoram, as somebody who has studied liberalism as a philosophical theory for a long time, were you surprised that sort of the culmination of that worldview were the events that you alluded to with Barry Weiss, the New York Times, Andrew Sullivan at New York Magazine, or a lot of people obviously around the United States were saying, oh my goodness, but for you, were you saying, well, of course this is what would happen?
Look, it was definitely surprising. I mean, we've been hearing warnings that this was that this was going to happen, at the very least since Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind in 1987. If you go back and read it, you'll see that. I mean, what he describes is the woke neo-Marxists on the university campuses, and he says, look, what happens on the campuses is going to happen throughout the country. Now, I'm one of those people who's been saying that for decades, and still the moment that it happened, the way that it happened, the intensity and the completeness of the collapse was surprising to me too. We're just not very good. Even those of us who have an inkling of what the future may hold, when it comes, it just is shocking. It just is.
Right, because a lot of people used to, even circa 2015, when a lot of these episodes were coming to a head on campuses, the Yale Halloween controversy, some people were still asking, why does certain commentators care so much about university campuses? And then a really persuasive answer is, well, the people who are in these campuses right now, 3 years from now, will be at the New York Times. They're going to be at banks. They're going to be everywhere. And but sounds like Yoram, you, and obviously one of our writers, Chris Augusta, has written a lot about the Closing the American Mind and sort of been on top of that. So Henry, I want to start getting you more involved. One thing that I know you've talked a lot about, and Yoram has talked about as well, and maybe this is a good way to kind of segue into sort of the meat of things, that there's sort of a popular conception floating around in a lot of the discourse that sort of Anglo-American conservatism began with Burke, but as you two know well, there are a lot of very important figures, Selden, Fortescue, who really predate that. Maybe this is a good opportunity for kind of Henry, you to take it away with things.
Yeah. So in your book, Yoram, you say that to rediscover conservatism, which it means that, quote, when faced with the disastrous consequences of a particular course of action, we must retrace our steps and restore, as much as possible, the conditions that existed prior to setting out on this course. So you've laid out the disaster of the last 2 years, basically. What is the conservative vision that we should retrace our steps to, in your view, and how should we pursue that going forward?
Well, I'm going to address myself to the United States. I simply know much more about what's happening there. There is a UK edition of the book, which is coming out in late August, and I'm going to be visiting London the week of September 18th. And I hope to learn much more and to be able to say intelligent things about the UK as well. But for the time being, I'll focus on the United States. In my book, I propose that the main wrong turn, the big wrong turn, takes place after the Second World War, after the 2 world wars and the Holocaust. People come back from these horrific and devastating wars, and they come back to the United States, and much the same kind of thing happens across Europe, and they ask themselves, what is it that we can do to make sure that this never happens again? Which is, it's a reasonable question, but you can give different kinds of answers to it. And the answer that post-war liberals came up with was that we need, as a country, as a civilization, we need to put an end to discrimination of any kind. They basically took the theory of the social contract state, where individuals who are perfectly free and perfectly equal make a contract in order to have a government which will better defend their equality and their individual liberties. They took that idea and decided to reconstruct America on the basis of those ideas in a strict and systematic and demanding sense. So if you look at the ongoing persecution of Blacks in the American South, for example, then I, like many others, feel that impulse was certainly noble and justified. That you just fought this huge war against Nazi racialism in Europe and defeated it, and so many Blacks fought in the American army, and so many Americans died for it. And you come home and you say, like, why are we persecuting Blacks in the United States? So that part makes sense. But what makes a little bit less sense to someone in the conservative tradition is you have this one job to do, which is to eliminate racial persecution in America, and you should focus on that. And what actually happened was that the civil rights legislation, the Supreme Court activism, the immigration legislation, and all sorts of other pieces of legislation ended up creating a whole series of, basically gave America a new Enlightenment liberal constitution, in which the heart of the whole constitution is non-discrimination, which means that not only are you going to prevent both public and private institutions from discriminating between Blacks and whites, but you're also going to prevent, in the same way, you hope, discrimination between men and women, between Christians, Jews, and atheists, discrimination between people who were born in the United States and people who live outside the United States and want to come in, discrimination among different foreign countries from which immigrants could come. And it simply keeps going. The imposition of public and private equality kind of became the central business of American government. And as soon as that's the central business of American government, then people start saying, well, what about discrimination on the basis of age? What about discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? And on and on. And what was created, not really intentionally, what was created was this kind of rolling, ongoing cultural revolution, in which any kind of distinction that anybody is making between one category or another, there's a prima facie case that that needs to be eliminated, and that immediately led to radical and, in my mind, totally unnecessary steps like banning Bible and prayer and God from American classrooms across the United States. I mean, this is this is kind of a French revolutionary moment in American history, where religion, which FDR and Eisenhower still thought was the bedrock of American civilization, of Anglo-American civilization, all of a sudden after World War II, it becomes the enemy of American civilization and needs to be driven out of the public sphere and into the private sphere. So, there's much more to be said about it, but the bottom line is that a very good motive to attain justice on a particular front ballooned into a utopian theory of how all injustice could simultaneously be eliminated, and the result has been endless destruction.
Yeah, I agree much with that. In the UK, we're having our own problems with the sort of downstream effects of this, because UK British culture is obviously influenced by American culture. And you can see this in the Tory leadership contest, where each candidate's sort of trying to lay out their position on every different areas of policy, but in particular cultural policy. And the best candidate, in my view, was this younger candidate, Kelly Badenoch, who was very strong on cultural matters. And now we have these two finalists, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, who, you know, as you say, to rediscover conservatism, you go back before the time when the problem started. That for them seems to be trying to out-Thatcher each other. Now, like you, I have a great deal of admiration for Margaret Thatcher and for Ronald Reagan because they were towering figures of their time. But my question is, there seems to be a perennial temptation in modern conservatism to sort of say, we must return to the way Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher did things, and anything else is heresy. And we sort of see that in Britain now. What do you think about that? Does national conservatism offer something more appropriate to the time we're actually living in your view?
Part of the problem when we talk about Reagan and Thatcher is that I don't think that they are properly remembered. I mean, the association of Reagan and Thatcher almost exclusively with economic liberties and universal human rights it's not a mistake, but it distorts what was actually happening. You know, many people are still alive like me who actually lived through those years, and in the book, I have a chapter I talk about the conservative revival at my university, Princeton, where my wife and I met, and we published a magazine.
Chapter.
Yeah, so we published a magazine called the Princeton Tory, which was the pro-Reagan Thatcher magazine, but the way that we experienced what was happening was not necessarily with economic liberties as the primary issue. I mean, everybody understood that in the struggle against the Soviet Union and against socialism in general, that the idea that the marketplace, that the economic activities of a nation should in general allow a very wide range of individual liberty and liberty to corporations. That was something that, you know, all of us believed that, but we were at least as interested, at least on our campus, we were at least as interested in Reagan and Thatcher's nationalism, in their support for Polish Catholic nationalism and national independence, in Reagan's support for a kind of a restoration of British national power during the Falklands War, the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars Initiative, which everybody understood as a national and a nationalist project at the time. And then there were the religious aspects of it. Reagan was closely allied with what today they would call Christian nationalists. In those days, they called them the religious right. Leaders like Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell, and Reagan would not have been elected without the intense support of both Protestant and Catholic religious people who he added to his coalition. And in many respects, these are simply not liberals. Their primary concerns were for things like issues like abortion. And if we see, you know, this stunning upset, constitutional restoration in the United States a month ago with the Dobbs decision to return regulation of abortion to the American states. This is a 50-year-long battle in which Reagan was directly and constantly engaged, and so was everybody else who was a part of his movement. Reagan was the sponsor of a constitutional amendment to return prayer to the school system in the United States. In other words, there was a religious and nationalist heart to Reaganism, and we got to see this with Thatcher as well, with her Bruges speech and her warning that that Britain couldn't submerge itself into a federal European Union because the independence of Britain was precious and crucial to Britain, crucial to the world. So I think we don't remember Reagan and Thatcher correctly. The most important thinker probably in the Reagan years was Irving Kristol, my teacher, and he summarized contemporary Anglo-American conservatism as having three planks: religion, nationalism, and economic growth. And he was absolutely explicit and clear that of those, religion is the most important. Now, not everybody during the Reagan years agreed to that or had to, but for those of us who kind of bought the whole Reagan-Thatcher program and not just the economic part, for those of us who were of that bent, what happened after Reagan and Thatcher left was that these great conservative figures, they won the war against the Soviet Union, they rolled back socialism, and we expected that there would be a flourishing of conservatism, of a conservative life, including nationalism and religious flowering. And instead, the opposite happened. Their heirs in the so-called conservative movement dropped religion and nationalism and sidelined and pushed to the sides anybody who spoke and thought in that way, and they set about trying to impose this utopian, borderless world liberalism in the name of conservatism, even though there was nothing being conserved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember reading the speech that Charles Krauthammer gave in the 90s when he said that sovereignty would have to be sacrificed in order to pursue world democracy and world peace. And I thought, yeah, that doesn't sound very conservative to me. So going off what you just said, one of the things which people seem to forget about Reagan is that he, as Henry Olson showed in his book, he was a lot more economically populist than people selectively forget. So my next question would be, in the National Conservatism Statement of Principles, there's a statement about funding research into technologies that can help the national interest, so particularly competing with China in today's world. Now, this has drawn a lot of outrage from more classically liberal thinkers who say this is basically, industrial policy, it doesn't work, it's wrong. So I guess I'm asking, does national conservatism present a reacquaintance with the idea that sometimes state power is necessary to pursue conservative aims? Is it a vision which says that culture is not always upstream of politics? Sometimes culture is downstream of politics, and that the two interconnect together.
Sure. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. The idea that government is inherently bad and inherently problematic, on the one hand, it goes all the way back to the Bible. The suspicion of government is the tendency of government to become too powerful, to become brutal, to become idolatrous, to take to itself aspects that, or attributes that really should only be left to God in dictating the way that the world ought to be. All of these things are already explored in the Bible, and the Anglo-American desire to restrain government, to limit government, for example, through a balance of powers among different branches of government, which we already see in explicitly in Fortescue, who's writing in the 1400s, and he's saying, in praise of the laws of England, he's saying, look at our balance of power between the king and parliament, and so all of these things are welcome. Conservatives are certainly not socialists. Conservatives do not believe, as the Marxists do, that you can open up some central office with really bright people and dictate the course of the entire economy of the nation. We don't believe anything like that. On the other hand, the Jeffersonian impulse to say the less government, the better. We don't need a central government. We don't need a standing army. We don't need a standing taxation. And we don't need a national tradition. We don't need a national inheritance, because every generation is going to use reason and can be completely independent from the previous generation. That whole utopian view in which human beings can live without government is completely alien to conservatism. Conservatives believe that human beings are flawed, and because we're flawed, we make mistakes, and sometimes tremendous mistakes. And our leading officials are their job, the reason that they exist, is in order to try to understand what are the great challenges that are facing us, and to try to save the nation, to alleviate the suffering of the people. I mean, that's also very clear from the Old Testament. And so I think, you know, I'm well aware of the immense importance that anti-government rhetoric played, you know, from William Buckley through to Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. That they needed that rhetoric in order to be able to defeat communism and to roll back socialism. I understand it, but you can't simply take the principle that we should all be free of government and set it loose as the only principle that should govern a nation, and expect that nation to survive more than a couple of generations after that. We tried that. That was attempted, and what we found is that even the most obvious government actions, like restraining gigantic monopolistic corporations, where they directly interfere in the electoral process in a democracy by suppressing the political speech of one side of the spectrum. Even something obvious like this, that the government has a responsibility to make sure that private corporations, private individuals don't grow so powerful that they make it impossible to conduct democratic elections. I mean, that is the simplest and most straightforwardly obvious responsibility of government. And yet we have all of these people saying, why no, it's a private corporation. It should be able to do whatever it wants. And this is, I mean, there's no chance at all that Reagan and Thatcher would have been on that side of the argument. I mean, their nationalism at the time was directed to freeing the economies of their countries so that their countries could be stronger. But they never would have supported a condition in which private corporations directly undermine the democracy and the strength of the country. I mean, it's just inconceivable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the, you're really you look really in depth at the US situation. I think in the UK, there's also obviously conservatism in the UK and the US is what we call a broad tent. There are different traditions within the tradition, as it were. In the UK, there's also a more, one might call it paternalist school of Toryism, which sees the use of state action in particular circumstances for the common good as not necessarily the end of the world. So, for example, in the 1950s, Anthony Eden, or the 1947 conference, he said, "We are not a party of unbridled, brutal capitalism and never have been. Although we believe in personal responsibility and personal initiative in business, we are not the political children of the laissez-faire school. We oppose them decade after decade." And then he went on to say, "Conservatism regards the family as the basic social unit and the sanctity of family life as vital to the health of the state." Now, that's from the 1940s, but it sounds very similar to what the statement of principles that we've both signed says. And I think it's another way of looking at the conservative tradition, which maybe was, as you said, dropped out of sight for the decades after the end of the Cold War. And the point of conservatism is that it's empirical, so it observes changing circumstances and adjusts to fit that. So do you think do you think that conservatism became too ideological over the empiricism that you rightly point out is one of the founding principles of the tradition?
Yes, I mean, I think it became too ideological, but I think that the ideology that it adopted was a liberal ideology.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know, so there's two different problems here. One is that conservatives historically are empiricists, and they advance by trial and error. And an important aspect of conservatism is being able to recognize mistakes that have been made and to restore earlier conditions in order to make up for an error. And if you're dogmatic, if you're ideological, if you think that you know that the answers to everything are in a set of axioms that you won't let go of no matter what, then it's very difficult to be a successful, a prudent statesman, and therefore it's very difficult to be conservative in that way. But there's a second aspect to it, which is that these dogmatic ideological principles are not conservative principles; they're liberal principles. We're not talking about people who are learned in scripture, who are misapplying through excessive dogmatism something that they read from the Bible that actually exists in Christian or Jewish tradition. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an extraordinary zeal and fanaticism in thinking that Enlightenment liberal principles, the perfect freedom and the perfect freedom and equality of the individual, obligations which accrue only through consent, and the supposition that that we're all rational beings, and if we just argue about things a bit, then we'll come to all the right answers. Everywhere in the world will come to the same answers. All three of these premises are these Enlightenment liberal premises are simply false. And so to have people who call themselves conservatives, both being rigid and dogmatic and unempirical on the one hand, and on the other hand, taking their axioms from a handful of unmarried, childless individuals who wrote these Enlightenment rationalist tracts in the 16 or 1700s. I mean, there's nothing conservative about it at all, and it's not capable of conserving anything. So I think we just got the worst of both worlds out of this.
Yeah, as you wrote a few years ago, conserving liberalism isn't conservatism, and I think it was de Junelot who said that liberalism is based on an ideology that came from childless men who've forgotten their own childhood. So it's sort of fantasy land philosophy.
I can say something really quickly. One of my favorite lines I remember from George Will is when he says, "It's no coincidence that Keynes, a man who was childless, said in the long run, we are all dead."
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think, and so that brings it back to the British context. So in Britain at the moment, we're in complete chaos. We don't know who the new leader of the Conservative Party is going to be. Nothing is working, and that's not an exaggeration. And it looks like we could be heading for a Labour government in 2 years' time. So it's all a bit of a mess here at the moment. So moving from that context to where you are, you're in Jerusalem at the moment. It seems that the governing coalition in Israel has sort of fractured slightly. Could you fill us in on what's going on there? Because it seems a bit chaotic there as well.
I'm really embarrassed to discuss it. I will, since we're among no, I will, since we're among friends. But
yeah,
it's
embarrassing here as well. So you're not
no, I know. I was about to make the connection that there's no coincidence that that in 2016 the American elites declared a resistance to Donald Trump and came up with all sorts of fantastic stories about how he was the illegitimate president, and
Russia.
Right, yeah. and then spent years in self brainwashing, trying to justify what was in fact the wrecking of the American democratic system, which is historically, as in Britain, as in Israel, historically based on the theory that peaceful and cooperative transitions of power between rival factions are the best way for civilized people to live. That's an assumption in all three countries. We inherited it from Britain, and but that requires a very large degree of self-restraint on the part of the opposition. When people you think are the wrong people are elected, then becoming the loyal opposition, restricting your opposition to those things on which you really disagree, and to those methods which are accepted within the democratic tradition. That's the key to the whole system. The minute that you turn the other party into a real enemy, you start to claim that they're fascists and they're about to destroy democracy and they're about to overthrow the Constitution. The minute you start talking like that, you start delegitimizing the elected government. Democracy starts very quickly moves towards collapse. And this is exactly the same thing that we saw in the UK after the Brexit vote. Yeah. The 3 years of deadlock in the British Parliament, which is, I mean, I have to tell you, as someone looking at this from overseas, that it was extraordinarily humiliating, extraordinarily shameful, and we have the same thing in Israel at this point. I mean, it's basically just as the left in America declared Trump to be an illegitimate president and therefore allowed anything and everything to try to prevent him from governing, and just as the anti-leave, the anti-Brexit elites in Britain decided that they would simply stop British government from being able to implement what the voters had asked for. We have the same thing in Israel. We have a parliamentary system which, because of the fact that it's proportional representation, it relies to an extraordinary degree on the willingness of all the parties to negotiate with some degree of good faith with the person who's the head of the largest faction. And what happened instead, and this is, I've said this in the Israeli press as well, is simply an imitation of the crisis of democracy in America and Britain, where the Israelis said, well, why don't we do that too? And all sorts of figures who had been stepped on and abused by Netanyahu over the years decided that they were going to ban him from being prime minister. And this decision to ban, the head of the largest, by far the largest political party, and by the way, also currently Israel's greatest statesman, but we're talking about democracy at the moment. The decision to place a ban and to say, we will not enter into a government unless he leaves power, that decision, picked up by a number of parties and pursued over the course of 3 years at this point, has left Israeli democracy a wreckage. And who knows how and when we're getting out of this.
Yeah, are you heading for another election soon, or are they holding it off as long as possible?
We're in a transition government, so by law there have to be elections, and there will be elections at some point in the coming months. The question is whether the outcome of the election will be any different. It depends basically on whether the public is capable of voting out of power those parties that placed this ban on Netanyahu. If they don't, then the deadlock will simply continue.
I read somewhere that Netanyahu may be trying to come back into government or into politics. Is that accurate, or is he? Because I know he's in some legal
No,
difficulties at the moment.
he's still the head of the Likud. He has not left politics.
True, yeah. So because as a result, he would be in
Meaning
politics and in government, yeah.
he continues to be, despite the fact that the judicial system and the legal system have put him on what appears to be simply an endless trial in order to delegitimize him. He hasn't been convicted of anything yet.
Yeah.
Who knows how long that trial is going to continue, but he remains the head of by far the largest party, and he also has a block of loyal parties. The nationalist and religious and conservative parties in Israel overwhelmingly support him, and the question is simply whether enough of his rivals are going to be eliminated in the next round of election or not. Our system is not built to do that.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult to know whether this crisis is going to end or not.
Yeah, you have my sympathy because, as you say, harking back to the 3 years from 2016 to 2019 in Britain, when one thing after another stopped the Brexit vote being implemented. Even you just mentioned the judiciary in Israel. I mean, here we had Supreme Court being politicized against Brexit and against, at that time, Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And yeah, I hear what you're saying about it being a painful thing to witness, because it was then in Britain and it is now in Britain, because it just seems to be complete chaos and nothing seems to be happening or working to the benefit of the country. And it's very sad. So hopefully we get conservative leadership at some point who, have the right ideas and can implement them, and for the good of the country and the people, because otherwise it's going to be, as Margaret Thatcher said, I don't like seeing Britain in decline, and at the moment we are in decline, economically, culturally, politically, militarily, in most ways, and it's quite depressing, really. So yeah, I feel your pain at the situation in Israel as well, because it's very similar.
Well,
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, one aspect of this to notice is that when I say that the Israeli elites are imitating the behavior, the destructive behavior of American and British elites, it's important to emphasize that this is not, they don't just read about each other in the newspapers.
Yeah. Yeah.
These are people who know each other and they meet one another. The Supreme Court justices in America and Britain and Europe and Israel, to a very significant degree, they are each other's reference group. I mean, this may be a little bit less so in the United States. The Supreme Court still has more of a tradition of national independence, but the Israeli Supreme Court, is explicitly and constantly concerned with what judges in Europe have said and what they're going to think about whatever happens in Israel, and it's extremely difficult to if we're talking about conservation and transmission, to understand your own national traditions and to do these strike these delicate balances among different aspects of the tradition, and what needs to be maintained and what needs to be restored and what can be repaired. These things are almost impossible to do when what you're doing is looking at other legal systems in which the judges are, basically begin with these abstract principles like everyone is perfectly free and everyone is perfectly equal, and then proceed from there to simply dictate what they think the law should be. So Israel has the same problem, that the public and the elected political officials there can be a majority who are interested in a conservative traditionalist Israel, and in building that up and strengthening it. And then you meet the roadblock. I mean, it's much worse than roadblock of Supreme Court justices who their minds are simply, they live in these French Revolutionary concepts, universal concepts, which they simply can't apply in Israel in good conscience. So they apply them in bad conscience. They just think it's for the improvement of all mankind.
Yeah. Well, in the UK, the Supreme Court was the creation of Tony Blair. So the point being that the underlying ideology of the Supreme Court is the same as the one that underlies the philosophy of the Israeli Supreme Court. It's the same radical sort of Enlightenment liberal ideology. So that would be why they're so similar. So we're coming to a close now. So I'll go to my last question. I noticed that on the guest list for the NatCon conference, the third NatCon conference in Miami this October, Paul Gottfried is one of the speakers, which I was very pleased to see. Now, as you know, in American conservative history, there was a philosophical and ideological war between the neoconservatives and the paleoconservatives. Does the fact that Professor Gottfried is speaking at NatCon, does that represent some sort of reconciliation between different factions of conservatism?
Well, look, I can't speak for the neoconservatives.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, NatCon is as an annual conference. It certainly has as one of its purposes to invite speakers who are kind of outside of the comfort zone.
Yeah.
Both in the direction of the left and in the direction of the right.
Yeah.
I mean, there have to be limits to that, of course.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, of course.
But we definitely do not feel that we are obligated to continue to maintain whatever feuds that
conflicts
there were a generation ago.
Yeah.
The paleoconservatives in particular, I think that many of the things that they fought for turned out to be right. I mean, without necessarily endorsing any particular figure, but if you take the overall framework of their views were nationalist. They were concerned with problems of immigration, which have turned out to be catastrophic, just as they said they would be. They were concerned with problems of free trade without any reference to whether you're trading with a country that you want to build up or whether you're trading with a potential enemy that can destroy you. Well, they were right about that too. So and just in general, I think that they had a clearer view of what a national a policy of national conservation and strengthening and transmission, what it would be. That doesn't mean that they got everything right, and
particularly on Israel.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting about Israel that Israel was for many years turned into like a picture of like some kind of idyll of liberal democracy by people who supported worldwide liberal democracy in Washington. And Israel's never been liberal in the way that they thought it was or should be. Israel's always been a much more conservative democracy throughout its history. Maybe not on every point, but in general, the place of the historic Jewish nation and Jewish people in Israeli public life, the place of the Bible in the schools and of Judaism in the public life of the country, the way in which we honor minorities that serve in our armed forces, we honor them as separate peoples with their own history and their own flags. This is much more of a conservative democracy than the neoconservatives wanted us to believe. And so this kind of strange thing that's happening is that now that, in the post-Trump, post-Brexit years, now that there's this sort of general shift taking place towards a national conservatism, and people are working out what those principles are, all sorts of people on the right look at Israel in a new light. I mean, these. I mean, you can see this explicitly. Various people say, I always felt strongly that that I shouldn't be on Israel's side because because they were on the side of the liberals.
Yeah.
But now that I look at Netanyahu's Israel and the way that Israel is being presented by Jewish figures writing about national conservatism, and they say, what, actually Israel, maybe I was wrong on some points, and we do in fact see some of that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the paleo-conservatives, Scott McConnell, who's one of the founders of the American Conservative, he wrote a piece a couple of years ago, basically saying, exactly that. I think it's two cheers for Israel, sort of marking that. So I think Christoph, that was quite a nice title, but basically saying, I was wrong about Israel, and actually it's doing a lot of the things that I agree with. So I think that sort of coming together, and as you say, we don't want to continue the feuds of 20 or 30 years ago, because A, it's pointless, and B, it's a waste of time. There's so much more important things to be thinking about. I'd just like to say, for me, I was honoured to be one of the signatories to the Statement of Principles. I think for me, national conservatism, it feels like much more of a philosophical home than the liberal conservatism of the David Cameron years, particularly in the UK, were. Because I feel I'm a part of the British nation, and I'm a part of it because I'm a British citizen, not because I contribute taxes or whatever. And the NatCon worldview, it makes me feel part of something, and gives me reminds me of a sense of place which the more liberal forms of conservatism and the liberal worldview itself deny me. So I just like to say, thanks for articulating that worldview for the rest of us to be a part of, because it's it's nice to feel sort of a sense of philosophical home, I suppose.
Well, that's very good to hear, but it really goes both ways. The admiration for Britain is it's a cornerstone of Zionism.
Yeah.
Theodor Herzl was a great admirer of Britain. David Ben-Gurion was a great admirer of Britain, and the things that we've learned and inherited from the British, including the British reflections on the Old Testament and its relevance to creating national life. All of this means that Israel is part of a family of nations together with American, Britain, and others, and not necessarily because of liberalism, but because of the conservative nationalist tradition that we share.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to say that conservatism is about reaching the universal through the particular, and Israel is the national embodiment of that principle. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
So I think this has been a great discussion. So maybe just right before we close, just a final question to leave things on. Yoram, you've alluded a little bit to in your answer to my first question about sort of what's changed in 2020 and perhaps this sort of ascendancy of the new right. And I just wanted to maybe bring things back to electoral politics for a second. As the American midterm season heats up, there's sort of kind of a mixed bag. Yesterday, Brittany Yannick, Dr. Oz's communications director, indicated that he would support a federal same-sex marriage legislation. On the other hand, Herschel Walker has suggested a possibility of a nationwide abortion ban. Some people see the candidacy of Blake Masters in Arizona as perhaps sort of embodiment of some of these principles. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts on the state of American electoral politics insofar as it intersects with some of the ideological commitments that you advocate?
Look, it takes time for new ideas to be expressed in politics, and because politics is politics deals with all sorts of things that don't have much to do with ideas. Just for example, if you have a well-spoken candidate who's attractive and forceful, if you happen to have that in a particular district, then there's a good chance that candidate will win without a tremendous amount of reference to what it is that they stand for. So it's the relationship between political ideas and political elections is always it's a little bit arbitrary. Sometimes it's very direct, and sometimes it doesn't work, and it takes a long time. But I think that if we look in general at the trajectory of the Republican Party after Trump, then I think that we do see a constant, steady growth of national conservative ideas, and this is in part because of Trump, but in part it's just other things. Let's take, for example, the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision. The Dobbs decision is the result of the work of both of Donald Trump and of Mitch McConnell, who is not really on most issues or on many issues a national conservative, and the Federalist Society, which has national conservatives. Many of them have had a deep skepticism of the Federalist Society, but it turns out that Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell and the Federalist Society together, and the Catholic and Protestant pro-life movement, that together they succeeded in banding together and creating this astonishing political upset. And it has put wind in the sails of all of these young national conservatives who were wondering, is it really possible to save this country? Is it really possible to save this system? Is it possible for any kind of traditional Christian, biblical idea to ever triumph in this country? And of course, there's plenty of people on the personalities on the fringes of the right who are telling them, no, it's impossible, it's dead, it's gone, there's nothing you can do. Just stay out of politics because it's all evil, and it's heading inevitably to some fantasy that I came up with. And all of a sudden reality is completely different. I mean, it's not completely different. We're still where we were before, except for the fact that all of a sudden you can see that through all of these imperfect actors, none of the people that I'm naming are ideal national conservatives, and yet at the same time they succeeded in working together to bring this astonishing upset. And it just gives you a clear view of how determination and resilience and smarts and coalition building and endless work in education can lead to restoration.
Gentlemen, thanks so much for this discussion. Henry, Yoram, I think you guys hit on a lot of really great points, so I'm so glad we were able to have this. So thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. God bless.
Great to see you again.
Take care.
See you again, Yoram. Bye.